Recently, the Ontario Secondary Schools Teacher Federation District 20, a teachers union in Ontario, voted through a controversial item at the general membership meeting. And so, in the name of equity and inclusion, they voted to weight the votes of quote unquote Black, Indigenous, and racialized members more than white members. And the goal would be to ensure that the votes of non white members will always represent at least 50% of the votes at the bargaining unit. And the local represents 1,400 teachers and staff. But to be clear, this voting measure would only apply to votes made by their leadership board. It wouldn't apply to votes by the general membership. And so, though the measure passed, it was reported that the vote was contentious, and some members raised the concern of, quote, reverse racism. And so, first, the union put out a video explaining why the policy change was made and how it would work.
Past practice of TBU Council were that each voting member get one vote. And that seems fair. One person equals one vote. But fair doesn't necessarily mean equitable. What if you found out that not all voices were being represented, especially those that belong to the most marginalized communities? Would this still be fair? Motion 8.2 was created to address the disproportionate representation of voting members at TBU Council. This means that quorum must include 50% representation of Indigenous, Black, or racialized members where possible. Otherwise, votes will be weighted to ensure a 50-50 representation. So what does this look like? Let's take a look at an example of voting on an issue. It has been brought to TBU Council that as a union, we have never recognized Diwali. It has been proposed that as we move forward, we need to change this. As a whole, 13 members voted for no and 7 voted for yes. As an entire council, we vote that we will not be officially recognizing Diwali as a holiday. Let's take a look at how this vote broke down across racial lines. For those who chose not to self-identify, 75% of the group chose not to officially observe this holiday. If we take a look at those who did self-identify, 75% of this group chose yes, we would like to observe Diwali. Now, why is this disconcerting? Well, this social justice issue is important to Indigenous, Black, and racialized members, but was not heard. When we use weighted voting, we can see that the final outcome is significantly different. In this example, with the weighted votes, we can see that 50% voted for the motion and 50% against. This is quite a difference from the original vote of 65% against the recognition of this holiday. Voices of non-identifying members are heard, and voices of Indigenous, Black, and racialized voices are amplified so that they can also be heard.
So, a lot to unpack there, but I think it would be very concerning if this becomes the normal trend in how union democracy takes place. Because, first of all, it's built on the fundamentally flawed assumption that non-white people, no matter their differences in racial identification or national origin or class background, will tend to vote the same on issues and thus can be counted as a unified voting bloc. Just anecdotal data and life experiences alone should make very clear that this is not true. But I think more profoundly, this approach of weighting certain votes more heavily than others undercuts the fundamental work a union organization fighting for racial justice needs to do. This approach discourages or disincentivizes the practice of union members, whether they're people of color or not, having to win over white members over to policies or practices that challenge racial inequality. That kind of real buy-in is what's needed in order to make substantial progress on these issues. The weighted voter system could be used to get more anti-racist positions passed on paper, but they won't be very meaningful if members aren't actually invested in them. And as organizers, we need to constantly be in the practice of persuasion, of winning over the majority to our positions, even if we have to do so in unfair conditions. And this policy, I think, has a high chance of leading to the resentment from white members and an uncomfortable feeling of tokenism from members of color. And we have inspirational models from the past we can look at to see how unions can be turned into vehicles for fighting racial inequality with buy-in from white members. An example I've brought up before in this show and I've written about is the United Packing House Workers of America, which represented workers in meatpacking plants across the country. Because their workforce was so diverse that they organized, they were forced to learn how to break down racial divisions and win white workers over to the fight for racial equality. And it's hard to imagine the union be able to do some of the things they did without truly winning over white workers. For example, Solidarity between black and white workers on the job was leveraged in fights to desegregate local bars, restaurants, and hotels. A particularly effective tactic was to send teams of black and white workers into a local bar asking for service. When the black workers were denied service, whites would also walk out. Back at the union hall, a complaint would be filed with the state's attorney, and usually the establishments would have to desegregate. So, in other words, this weighted voting system almost feels like a shortcut to the hard work of moving difficult and controversial work and policies and conversations through a democratic body. And it's not just in labor where we're seeing these kinds of proposals. Some have called for a similar system to be used in our electoral democracy. So in 2020, Brandon Hausbrecht wrote in The Nation and called for a kind of vote reparations, saying, we can implement vote reparations by double counting ballots cast by all black residents. Because white votes currently count more than black ones, double counting black votes would restore electoral balance. Vote reparations would be a giant step towards remedying our nation's long history of denying and devaluing black votes. To address systemic racism, we must transform how we choose our government. Even if vote reparations aren't instituted, black voters will keep tirelessly dragging our states towards a more perfect union. But just imagine if our votes counted twice. And again, I think this idea would immediately run into practical problems that stem from the basic fact that Black people can have and will continue to have diverging views and interests. For example, we know that throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there was substantial support from many Black communities for the vast expansion of the carceral state for a variety of complicated reasons. Today, polling on defunding the police finds that it has the least amount of support among Black communities. And this should not be surprising if we take seriously the idea that Black people are not a monolith and, like any other group of people, will have a variety of political viewpoints and interests. And this also means that giving extra weight to the votes of minorities probably won't end up where self described anti racists expect it to. And we're in a time where we desperately need to build majoritarian coalitions of working people. This is needed both in our movement organizing and in electoral politics. It's needed not just to win meaningful reforms, but to protect and consolidate those reforms. We're in a moment where we don't just need to convince working people that change would be good, which I think is actually the easier part. We need to be able to convince people that change is possible and that they need to be a part of making it a reality. I think the best organizers can relate to people as full, complex human beings that they are. Good organizers also don't make assumptions. You don't know until you have the conversation what person's most important issues are, or what it will take to get them to take action. For example, many teachers care more about being able to get a bathroom break than maybe they do about their pay, or care more about their after school programs getting cut than their class size. And you only know as an organizer when you have this conversation. So, in conclusion, this weighted voting system makes too many assumptions about people of color as union members and as a voting bloc, and it circumvents the difficult, persuasive work of building majority support and buy-in for one's positions. So, Jen, I'm sure you have a lot to say on this. This is kind of like a Jen style segment, but
Yeah, Paul, you're taking over.
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, that video was I had not watched it before. It's crazy. I can't believe that a video team, group of people made that animation and made that video in order to explain to union members why some people's votes should be counted differently than other people's. I mean, I think that all of your points about, not treating, non-white or like as they call it, racialized people as a cohesive block or constituency. That's a very fair point. I absolutely agree. But at the same time, like, no matter what their motivations are, this idea is like totally batshit.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. And also, I think one thing too is like, and this is just something I think the left needs to be better at, like a certain just very pragmatic understanding of strategy. And, in this context, is like, understanding that this kind of thing will probably breed a lot of resentment from honestly not just white members but probably many white members, right? And it's like, and that also goes for many other kinds of ideas and policies, and it's like we can think maybe that's unfair, or we can say that's problematic that they would feel resentment at this or they shouldn't. Even if you want to make that argument, like it's a certain reality that we basically can guarantee 100% that they will feel that resentment, and it's going to be harder to do things in the unions in the union in the future on that basis. And I think, we got to get better at just like recognizing a certain reality and maybe saying maybe a different approach is better for trying to do these things we want to do.
Right. I think the other point that you made about how it will also lead to feelings of tokenism among,
Right.
the so-called racialized people whose weights are suddenly being counted more. Like, that's creepy. If you were in that situation, wouldn't you be like, this is creepy?
Yeah, and also another practical question is like, I mean, what about issues that they discuss this board is voting on that does not necessarily have to do with race or
Hmm.
identity? So it's
Hmm.
like, what if it's like a budget question? I think it would raise eyebrows and questions of like why necessarily on that issue should certain people have more weighted votes. But and again, I don't want to speak for those teachers in Ontario. Like again, it did pass. I don't know how the members
It
felt.
passed under the old non-weighted system.
That's a good question.
Good
I guess
question.
I had
We
to.
don't know.
But I just know if I were in that situation, and in that case, my vote would be one of those that would be weighted, that would just make me extremely uncomfortable and just
Hmm.
feeling weird and kind of just like feeling that other people would resent me for that. So again,
I think
I don't know if this is going to be a new trend. I hope not, but we'll see what happens.
also your comments about how we want to and how we're trying to build a majoritarian coalition are really pertinent here. And I know that we'll get into a little more of this with Chris Maizano once he comes on. But like, that's just it. We want to build majoritarian coalitions. We don't want a minoritarian rule that is more diverse, right?
Right. Yeah, and again, I think if we actually want to achieve racial justice, and I know I always bring up the packing house workers of America, but again, what was so incredible to me is again, you're talking about like the 1940s, 1950s, like they actually managed to win over many white workers to support these explicitly
Hmm.
they wouldn't use the term anti-racist policies, but policies that address racial discrimination. And again, that's a much better place to be in than if they had weighted votes and kind of like begrudgingly they
Right.
just had to accept. I don't think you would have the buy-in from the members to be able to do, more meaningful work. And I think so this kind of is like just feels like a shortcut to having to do the work, as they say, the much more difficult work of making that happen.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the most meaningful, civil rights legislative victories, just speaking, on a national level and not just isolating it to a union, like all of those reforms were also won by broad-based majoritarian coalitions fighting from the ground up. They were not these kind of like top-down efforts to engineer so-called equity by doing like weird shit like weighting people's votes differently. And I think that like as you were saying, that's what makes change and reform more durable in the long term is when it comes from a broad-based coalition from the bottom up rather than the opposite. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.